Hello, everyone. This is Craig Watson from Kings and Generals, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast. What you're about to listen to is actually a podcast interview I did over my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, with author John Bruning. John Bruning has written over 25 books covering everything from World War II, the Vietnam War, to more modern warfare-like operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The interview is about his upcoming book, 53 Days on Starvation Island, the World War II battle that saved the Marine Corps aviation. I can't recommend this book enough to Guadalcanal lovers out there. The book covers the plight of the aviators on Guadalcanal. It tells the stories of men, their hardship, their endurance. It's really awe-inspiring. His book comes out on May the 14th, so please, show him some love. Give it a look. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast Week by Week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I'm releasing some long-format documentaries. The last one was on the opening of Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Check it out. All right, everybody. Hi, my name is Craig Watson. This is the Pacific War Channel, where we cover the Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945 and all the major events that led up to it. Today, I am joined by a new guest, an author of a book that's coming out, John Bruning. How are you?
I am great. I'm just really happy to be here. Thank you for having me on, Craig.
And, I just want to say a little bit about you to the audience, because you've written extensively, it seems. So you've written over 22 books, counting this one, I believe?
This one's 25 now, actually.
25. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And well, just to list a few of them for the audience, you had a national bestseller, Indestructible, Outlaw Platoon, which you wrote with Sean Parnell, Shadow of the Sword with Jeremiah Workman, How to Break a Terrorist with Matthew Alexander, House to House with David Bellavia, The Devil's Sandbox, and Ghost, and countless others. And you've written extensively on various different parts of history and modern warfare for that example. I believe you were working in Afghanistan?
I was. I went over ostensibly as a photojournalist, and I did photojournalist things, but really what I was a battlefield tourist because I wanted to see what was going on and what it was really like. And I ran my own little IO operation while I was there. Writing stories for local papers that couldn't afford to have an embedded, journalist paid and deployed. So I sent articles to the small town papers around Oregon where I was, working with guys and observing what they were doing, men and women in eastern Afghanistan and then later in southern in Helmand province.
It's incredible. And to cut to the point, you have a new book coming out, 53 Days on Starvation Island, the World War II battle that saved the Marine Corps aviation. And I got to say, right off the bat, I find the title compelling and interesting. I myself,
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I write extensively on Guadalcanal, and I love referring to it as Starvation Island because I feel it really gives a flavor as to why it was unique.
For sure. And, everybody who knows anything about Guadalcanal knows that was the nickname the Japanese gave it.
Yeah.
But what shocked me as I really got into the nuts and bolts of this story of these two first Marine squadrons into Guadalcanal was how they starved as well. I mean, all of those guys lost incredible amounts of weight, and they were skinny, fit, trim young men to begin with. And, some of them lost 20, 30 pounds.
Certainly.
Which is, 20 to 30% of their body weight in 8 weeks. So
I think it would surprise a lot of the members of my audience because for one of the podcasts that I write for, the Pacific War Week by Week, when it came to Guadalcanal, I tried to give the Japanese perspective as much as I could, following some of their commanders. And the overall theme is they were starved out of the island, more or less. But when we're talking about the American forces, the Marines in the beginning, when it comes to the conversation of food, I mean, of course, it was miserable living conditions, but for the first bit, they had provisions, and then it started to really become an issue. Eventually, they had to eat actually some stuff that they had stolen from the Japanese around Henderson Field.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, you look at that one raider raid behind Japanese lines on the east side of the perimeter. They found all that food and they took as much of it as they could with them because they needed it. The rest of
Yeah.
it, they destroyed because they couldn't get it out in time. But food became, that was as important, if not more so, than every other uh, thing that kept a modern army running. I mean, just there was a shortage of everything on the island, from the bombs that the SBDs were carrying to machine gun ammunition to spare parts to even basic things like tires were in extreme short supply, in part because the ship that was bringing in all of that extra stuff ended up running aground repeatedly, and the skipper ordered all of that stuff, or a lot of it, to be thrown overboard to
Yeah.
lighten the vessel.
Yeah, as the Marines would say, they were left on the island with not much. They had to really rough it out.
Yeah, yeah, and so 53 days is the story of the first two Marine squadrons that came into Guadalcanal. They arrived on August 20th, 1942. It was VMSV 232, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 of those under the command of Major Richard Mangrum, and then 19 F4F Wildcats under the command of John L. Smith, the VMF 223 commander. And those guys went in really without a full understanding of what they would be facing. And over the months that followed, or the weeks, really, I mean, the 53 days they were on the island, they faced, I mean, just every imaginable threat an American warrior has ever faced. They faced it right alongside the Mud Marines.
Yeah.
They were sniped. They were shelled. They were bombarded by naval gunfire. They were bombed. They were shot out of the sky by Zeros. They were shot and killed by the gunners on the G4M Bettys. It was an extraordinarily difficult, probably the most difficult deployment any American aviator has ever endured.
Certainly. And when you look at the situation, we have veteran Japanese pilots in better aircraft at the time. So the Americans are coming into this limited aircraft definitely inferior to, well, if you're to compare the F4F against the Zero fighter at this time, yeah, it's, I would take the Zero, but I mean, well, there's advantages to both aircrafts, of course. And I think actually during this interview, it'd be great if you can explain, maybe my audience doesn't know so much about the history behind even the Brewster Buffalo before it, that some of these men would have flown, or the Buccaneer for a limited amount of time. But for the fighter pilots, they're going to have to use the F4F, which was, let's say, it made them better pilots.
Indeed. So the standard U.S. Marine Corps fighter at the outbreak of the war was the leftover F-2A Buffaloes that had been hand-me-downs from the main fleet from the Navy. The Marines always get the hand-me-downs, right? Those saw combat in only one place, and that was Midway. And the thing to keep in mind, actually, about this whole time period is the three times that the Marine aviators came in contact with the Japanese prior to Guadalcanal, they were utterly wiped out each time. And the first was at Eva during Pearl Harbor. The Marine aviation there was just crushed on the ground. They never even got airborne. And then VMF 211 at Wake was wiped out, and they went down hard. Like, they became national heroes. Henry Elrod received a Medal of Honor, but they were still completely destroyed. And after their last aircraft was lost, they basically turned out as infantry and fought on the beach.
Yeah.
during the Japanese landings. And then at Midway, you had two squadrons, VMF 221 and VMSB 241. And the fighter squadron was nearly wiped out. They lost 15 pilots, and all but two of their aircraft were either shot down or non-flyable out of 25. And those were the Buffaloes. They had 7 F4Fs, I think. 6 were flyable that day. The others were F2As. And one of the things that I discovered through the course of the research, and this was something that my research assistant, Larry Lassise, brought up, which was just such a really important point, I thought. If you look at the Buffalo, it did not have a headrest, and there was no armor plating that extended above the back of the pilot's shoulders. So the supposition among the surviving pilots from Midway was that the Buffalo actually had a weak point in its armor, and guys were killed from headshots, basically from behind when Zeros were behind them. And that is what really set the Wildcat apart, because Grumman was, well known for making rugged aircraft, and justly so. I mean, the Hellcat was an amazingly rugged platform, and the Wildcat was too. But really, where it shined was the fact that the armor plate behind the pilot extended all the way to the headrest and above slightly his head, which protected him better from the 20 millimeter shrapnel from the Zero's 20 millimeter cannon, and would stop 7.7 millimeter machine gun bullets.
Yep.
So in a pinch, the guys, if they couldn't shake a Zero, they would be, which they normally could not, especially if they were low and couldn't dive away. But if they didn't have any chance to escape and they had a Zero or Zeros on their tail, they would hunker down behind the armor plate and just sit there and take the beating, and the armor plate would hold. But that said, the Wildcat did have a couple of weaknesses, the worst of which was the oil line went through the top of the cowling. And if you had a Zero that was attacking you from above and behind and raking the fuselage, one hit on that oil line would often spray superheated oil into the cockpit and scald the pilot. And that's what happened to one of John L's pilots, John Lindley. There were several other instances where that happened on Guadalcanal. And I had no idea that was an issue. But those guys were very badly burned. It was a weakness in the design. And to be honest with you, I don't know if it was ever solved or not.
Probably not, because they went as soon as they got their hands on one of the first Zeros that went off in the Aleutian Islands campaign. From that wreckage, they designed the Hellcat, which would replace the F4F. I don't think they would have fixed it in time, because the Hellcat, well, it did take a while to come into service, of course, but and ironically, the Zero fighter would have the opposite attributes to the Wildcat, whereas the Wildcat was slower, a little heavier, had a lot of firepower, mind you, a little needless when they added more guns, but it had its armor. The Zero had no armor. It was more maneuverable. It was faster, of course. Made for an interesting comparison when they were fighting each other. Of course, for the Wildcats, they are usually in an inferior situation unless they are at a higher altitude and they can swoop down. And when the thatch weave, when that did come about, that definitely helped pilots against the green Japanese. The veteran Japanese pilots, apparently they had figured it out pretty quick and they managed to overcome the thatch weave. But of course, the Japanese veterans, after the first year of the war, they get knocked out pretty quick, and they're not getting replenished. Not like the Americans, who properly used their veteran pilots to train other pilots and actually built up a real corps of men.
And that actually was one of the results of the lessons learned in this first 53 days on Guadalcanal. And the crazy thing about this deployment for these two squadrons, so John L. Smith was bumped up to squadron command ahead of a bunch of peers and people who had been in the service longer and flying longer than he had been. So he was tagged by his superiors as somebody who they thought was going to do a good job as a squadron commander. Richard Mangrum had been in service since the late 20s flying, and was a Marine reservist for a while too. So he had a lot more experience than John L., but both of them were thrust into the same situation when they got these squadrons. Mangrum had his right after Pearl Harbor, but they weren't full squadron complements. They didn't have enough people. They didn't have enough planes. They didn't have enough spare parts. They were barely limping along trying to train through early 42. And then in July, they both got called into MAG 23's headquarters, and they were informed that their squadrons were going to be completely flushed out and they needed to be ready for combat in 30 days with all of these new pilots who were coming in. And what the Marines did was they took some of the veterans from Midway and salted them between the two squadrons, actually between the 4 squadrons in MAG 23. They spread them all out. So the fighter pilots were split between the 2 fighter squadrons in MAG 23, and same with the dive bomber units. But what ended up happening was the Midway guys were supposed to be the voice of combat experience in these new squadrons, but they had been so traumatized by Midway. What they were was very much the voice of doom and gloom, that none of them were going to live through whatever they were about to go through. And this was a problem because the bulk of the squadrons were fleshed out with these kids straight from stateside training schools who had minimal time in fighters or dive bombers. They just come straight, in some cases, from training in SNJs. And, you know, the way the pipeline was supposed to work was once they got to San Diego, after they graduated from flight school, they were supposed to get some significant combat aircraft time. And it didn't happen. There just wasn't enough time for that. So they got thrown on aboard ships and taken to Hawaii, where they reported for duty. And some of them had maybe 8 hours in F-2A Buffaloes, a couple of hours of familiarization flights in F-4Fs, but nothing like what they were going to need to actually be an effective fighting force against the Japanese, especially at this point in the war. So Marion Carl, who was a survivor of Midway and was one of the few who wasn't doom and gloom, became the operations officer for John L. Smith. And the two of them kind of huddled up, and along with Rivers Morrell, who was the XO. He was an Academy grad and had this great history as one of the football stars on the Navy's team back in the day in the 30s. So he was well known. The three of them sat down and like, okay, how are we going to train these guys? They've never even flown F-4Fs. We only have 30 days, and we're going to be in battle against among the best aviators in air combat history, you know?
Yeah.
And the decision was made by John L. to focus on 2 things. They knew they were going to be responsible for the defense of whatever base or outpost they were going to be thrown into. That meant intercepting bombers. That was going to be their primary job. So the best way to do that with a minimal chance of losses was going up to as high an altitude as they could stand physically, and then dropping down in overhead passes on the Japanese bombers. And that required really, really good deflection shooting, because you were, going straight down 350, 400 miles an hour in an aircraft, shooting in an aircraft that's moving at 250 miles an hour on a horizontal plane.
Yeah.
So it was tricky, but that's all they did for 30 days. They just trained that. There was the 223 didn't use the thatch weave. They, as far as I could see in combat, there was even no mention of it among any of the pilots that survived. But they did fly in pairs for sure. So they got as good as they could in a month doing those 2 things, gunnery and overhead attack tactics. And at the same time, Mangrum was basically had made the same decision with his guys. The SBDs, their responsibility was going to be to destroy enemy shipping or enemy troops barges, things like that. So they just did nothing but bombing and gunnery the entire time they were in Hawaii. And then they were told they were heading out at a specific date. I can't remember. I think it was August 3rd, a Tuesday, and everybody got leave. So they were all going into town to have one last, good time before they headed south to the great unknown. They didn't know where they were going.
Yeah.
And all that got canceled. They were told to leave immediately, and they had to round everybody up, and they got everybody from the 2 squadrons aboard the USS Long Island, except one enlisted guy who got left on the beach. They couldn't find him. And that was the story of their workup for this deployment. I mean, these guys were, they were not Band of Brothers like you see the 101st Airborne guys. They trained together in the States, and they trained together in England before they went into combat. They were with each other through all the hell that Captain Sobel put them through, right?
Yeah.
This was 1 month. And the saving grace in terms of getting these 2 squadrons to gel was the fact that within the squadrons, some of the new pilots had been buddies since childhood or college.
Yes.
And they'd known each other forever. They joined the Marine Corps together, and they ended up in the same squadrons together. So it was almost like a National Guard unit, say in 2003, 2004 Iraq, where everybody knew everybody, and they worked with each other. They were in the same neighborhoods growing up, that kind of thing. And that's, I think, what allowed these 2 squadrons to gel so quickly. And they needed it because obviously 20 days after they departed, they end up on an island most of them would have never been able to have found it on a map. And all of a sudden they are the tip of the spear, and probably one of the most important components on the island.
And definitely unorthodox. They're at the beginning, I mean, they're under Vandergrift, trying basically to just hold on to Henderson Field. And that's the basis of everything. The name of the game was any times the Japanese were trying to reinforce the island, because they had been taken by surprise. The American landings, it was very bold, and it was a gamble to do so. But every time the Japanese made an effort to try and reinforce, whether it was supplies or provisions, it was up to the airmen first to try and hit them. And hit them they did. You could say they did the lion's share of getting rid of the shipping that was coming over.
It was the greatest contribution. If you look at how the air component factored into the early days of the campaign.
Yeah.
You have the initial assault from the Ichiki Battalion, and that that really didn't ever have a hope to succeed because he jumped the gun.
Oh,
and now,
yeah,
that you see that scene. Was it in episode 1 or 2 of the Pacific?
I think it's I want to say episode 2. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was the first night on the ground for John L. Smith, Mangrum, and Marion Carl. They were, in fact, a lot of the enlisted gunners were asleep under the wings of their SBDs when the attack broke out the night they arrived. And so that was their introduction of what they were going to be facing and dealing with. And the first missions they flew were in support of that ground battle, hunting down barges and landing craft and shooting up troop concentrations wherever they found them. So, that was the introduction. And then obviously it wasn't long before they ran afoul of the Japanese Naval Air Force out of Rabaul. And that became kind of the defining feature for the fighter pilots, was trying to stop those guys. But for Mangrum and VMSB 232, their job was to stop the incoming shipping. And one of the problems with that was the Japanese did not oblige and sail stately down the slot in broad daylight, usually within air range. They would come in at night, which meant that if they wanted to actually stop this, they were going to have to attack at night.
Yeah.
And so you see the birth of Marine Corps night interdiction operations right here, with 232 kind of winging it. They experimented and played around with ways they could increase visibility and illumination by having PBYs drop flares for them and things like that. But it was never very successful. But they were trying, and that's not something you see really in the secondary sources. It's how much these guys flew at night, and virtually none of them had any night flying experience of note before they got there, and yet very few of them in the squadron. Actually, in 232, they didn't lose anybody, I don't think, during the night operations.
And you had you made a point of this in the book, which I was really happy to hear about, because it's there's a famous book by John Dower that has to deal with the racist attitudes of the Pacific War. What I found so interesting is how it crept into the Navy and the Army, their officer corps. They had these racist beliefs that actually hurt training, because there was those who legitimately believed the Japanese wouldn't fly at night, that they had terrible eyesight in general, they wouldn't fly at specific times of day, like at dawn or at dusk, that they weren't good pilots to begin with, and other things. But the Japanese had exclusively trained for night fighting, and this was from the air units to the land units and the Navy, because they had their own racist beliefs that the Westerners and Americans were effeminate, they didn't like to fight in the rain, and all sorts of kind of funny things. And then you see this merging where one side believes they're not going to be contested at night, and the other side's training specifically to attack them at night. So it led to a brutal awakening for the first 6 months of the war.
Truly, it's shocking when you look at the intelligence documents from the fall of 1941 all the way into early 42. We knew the Zero was there. I've seen the 3-view schemes or plans of the Zeros in the U.S. Navy intel files from that time period. But the rest of the stuff, they were way off. I mean, they thought that the Japanese were flying Italian BR-20s. I mean, that's what they thought the G3ML was. And there was such a lackadaisical attitude towards the Japanese Air Forces, the Imperial Navy and Army Air Force, that going into the fight, the United States pilots had no idea what they were up against. And you see that time and time again. Actually, all the Allied pilots, the RAF, the Australians in Southeast Asia, the Dutch, they were just mowed down because there was that racial bias that informed the way that we approached intelligence gathering on the Japanese there. And it took a huge mindset to turn that around and realize, okay, we're facing a really professional force and we're not ready for this. And it cost a lot of lives. It's one of the timeless lessons from this whole period in history for anybody who is, a young up and coming officer in the American military.
Yeah, it was extremely, I myself, I'm Canadian. Canada's 80% of the taste that our forces got in the Pacific War was during the Battle of Hong Kong at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, right.
Some of the British officers, they had these same racial attitudes. They didn't believe the Japanese would perform a night crossing over the strait to come into Hong Kong Island proper. And they didn't set up proper defenses simply because of this one stupid belief they had. And the Japanese did exactly that. So,
yeah. It was a problem. Now, that said, the Marine veterans of Midway within the two squadrons, guys like Danny Iverson, he was one of the survivors of Midway. In fact, his airplane is on display at the Pensacola Naval Aviation Museum. He had survived Midway, and he came out of that experience with the understanding that the SBD was essentially a sitting target without fighter escort.
Yeah. So
the entire time they worked up, and in fact, on board the Long Island, he wouldn't shut up about this. Was, if we're going to go out and bomb any significant naval target, we've got to have John L. Smith's pilots escorting us over and over and over again. And he was very, very downcast about it. So was another dive bomber pilot who actually probably ended up with more combat dives than any other American pilot of the war, and that was Bruce Prosser from Oregon. He had survived Midway as well, and they realized that all of this talk that the Japanese were going to be pushovers and that they were nearsighted and they were flying, you know, old, outdated Italian and German designed airplanes, it was just nonsense. And they saw the reality, which was, you know, in 3 missions at Midway, that dive bomber squadron lost all three of their commanding officers. Their leadership was gutted. They lost most of their planes and most of their fellow Marines. And the same thing with 221. So the reality of combat in those few missions that were flown at Midway provided enough of a wake-up call that John L. Smith took this very, very seriously, and so did Mangrum. They realized that they were going to be going into the mouth of the lion. And in fact, they were trying to be upbeat about it, and then the senior officer present on the Long Island was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Fike. He was a war hero from the Nicaraguan campaign, wore the Distinguished Flying Cross, was well respected in the Corps at a time when, you know, prior to World War II, there were only a couple hundred Marine aviators. It was a tiny force. And Fike gathered the guys around on August 20th on board the Long Island before they took off. And he told them, look, your mission here is to buy time with your lives. So the United States can bring up more planes and more pilots to take your place and keep Guadalcanal in American hands. So if you're a young kid fresh from flight training and a war hero commanding officer who's a lieutenant colonel, you know, the MAG 23XO, or maybe he was the ops officer, I can't remember. But anyway, he was one of the senior officers in MAG 23. And he says all that to you. I mean, morale just plummeted right there before they even got to the island. Yeah. And then as they headed north from the Long Island, this little extremely dangerous, clunky first of the baby flat tops launched them from a position, I think it was about 180 miles south of Guadalcanal. And Charlie Fike promptly got lost and was about to lead John L. Smith's guys out into the middle of the ocean. And it would have been a reprise of what happened to Fighting 8 at Midway, where most of those guys ended up in the water, right? Well, as a testament to his leadership, I mean, John L. was a guy who never put his career before his men. And, you know, he couldn't break radio silence and in the first place, but, you know, calling over the radio, hey, by the way, Lieutenant Colonel, you're off course, would not have gone well for him at all. I mean, that would have created all sorts of weird dynamics with him and Fike. But what he did do was he just altered course and went and followed Mangrum and the dive bomber pilots, and the rest of the squadron followed him. And ultimately, Fike realized his error after they had abandoned him, and he came up and brought up the rear. He was actually the last of the pilots down that day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like right at that moment, they realized that their senior officer, the one guy who was above Mangrum and Smith, was not a particularly competent pilot, and he certainly wasn't very good at pep talks. So when they got down to Guadalcanal and got out of their planes, the Marines came out of the jungle, and, you know, they were covered in filth and mud and dirt encrusted faces, and some of them were crying. They were so glad to see, you know, the aviators come in to help them and support them. And so they had this amazing reunion on the runway. And at that moment, you really knew who was in charge of this group. It was John L. and Mangrum. It wasn't Fike. So, yeah, I mean, just adversity after adversity, leadership challenges. And the thing that held them together was the fact that they had 2 excellent officers and a heck of a fighter pilot and a heck of an officer who would ultimately be a major general in Marion Carl.
I know. I think one thing that my audience will really appreciate, because for both podcasts that I do, we cover the great failure of Kawaguchi's offensives to try and take Henderson Field. And when we look at the what the Air Forces had to do at the very beginning when Kawaguchi was actually coming over to Guadalcanal, and then whenever he was trying to receive his supplies, it certainly helped the effort of defending Henderson Field to get rid of a lot of it before it even would come their way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I really became convinced of as I was doing the research on the book was how important 232's role was there. You look at all the secondary sources, you read the books, and you see 232 mentioned only a couple of times, right at the end of August during Eastern Solomons, and then the August 28th convoy that they hit and forced to turn around, Tanaka's guys. And then they just vanish. But really where I think they played the biggest role was when Kawaguchi split his force, took some of it down to Taivu Point on fast destroyers, right?
Yeah.
And then the rest, as I'm sure your listeners and your audience know, went by landing craft and barge from the Central Solomons, right?
The
this
ant
was the
transport.
craziest thing. Ant
Yeah.
freight, yep. So it was so among the duties that VMSB 232 had was to carry out the morning patrols, search missions to see what was out there. And they were the ones that first spotted these barges. And they're like, why are these things, all clustered around little islands to the northwest? Well, they realized pretty quickly what they were trying to do. I mean, it was essentially an attempt to infiltrate, men and supplies into Guadalcanal in such a way that they would be overlooked and go unnoticed by what became known as the Cactus Air Force.
Yeah.
Well, when this started in early September, there were still only a couple of not even 24 SBDs on the island. You had 232. You had Flight 300, which was a group. It was a strike from U.S. Navy aircraft carrier that had come in and was serving alongside 232. They were basically plussing them up. And then you had the 67th Fighter Squadron and their P-400 Air Cobras with the 20 millimeter gun in the nose, along with VMF 223, the Wildcats. So there wasn't a lot of air power available. These barges were all over the place. It was hard to find them. They were scattered. They were in little inlets and coves. And so this occupied 232 all the way up to the Battle of Edson's Ridge, was tracking these things down and figuring out ways to destroy them, because just going after them with 500-pound bombs wasn't cost effective. They were short of bombs.
Yeah.
So they tried strafing them with the available SBDs that had their forward firing guns working. The problem was most of 232's SBDs had some sort of synchronization failure, and their forward firing 50s were either jammed or non-functional or would shoot holes in their propellers. So they didn't really have effective forward firing armament. So what Mangrum and the others conceived was a wagon wheel tactic where they would orbit around a barge convoy that they would find and just basically let their gunners in the rear seat hose them down from low altitude, which of course exposed them all to extensive light anti-aircraft fire. Yeah. But it was very effective. The P-39 or the P-400s, which was the export version of the P-39, they were even more effective. The 20 millimeter could really do some damage to those barges and landing craft. And ultimately, those attacks, which were spearheaded by 232, cost the Japanese about 300 men out of a little more than 1,000. I think they put on the ant freight shipments.
Yeah.
And the rest of them were scattered all over the place. The ones that got to Guadalcanal never got to Taivu Point. They were dumped on the west side of the perimeter. So, Kawaguchi's battalion or brigade did not ever arrive as an integrated force. And you could, I think, make a case that without those guys, without those extra 1,000 men, Kawaguchi was doomed to fail with his attack, which was, if you look at it, was brilliantly conceived. I mean, they found the hole in the perimeter, and it was only through, Edson kind of manipulating Vandegrift that there were even raiders on the ridge itself. So this is, when you look at Guadalcanal, this to me, I mean, a lot of people and a lot of historians will argue that October was the crisis month. And there's a case to be made for that. But I think this was probably the best opportunity the Japanese had at splitting the perimeter and forcing the Marines to just withdraw into the jungle and fight a guerrilla war. I mean, can you imagine the devastating impact the failure of America's first offensive in World War II would have had on the home front?
I mean, for those not so familiar, I find the general audience, they're kind of almost bamboozled by the extravagance of Midway, because at Midway we see a clear surface engagement. We see a lot of aircraft carriers from the Japanese get destroyed. A lot of people would think that was the great turning point of the Pacific War. But it's truly Guadalcanal, because after Guadalcanal, the Japanese lost the initiative for the entire Pacific War. And it changed everything. It put America on the offensive, put the Japanese slowly on the defensive, but it basically gave the Americans the ability to choose where they would pick to do their battles. It also established what was the final part of the logistical line for the Japanese, because Guadalcanal was, well, the Solomon Islands in general, that was the furthest that they could ever even hope to stretch their supply line, which was overstretched to begin with. They didn't really have good planning when it came to how they were going to get supplies to their men on that island. But for the Battle of Edson's Ridge and just Kawaguchi's plans in general, in a typical Japanese fashion, his plans were amazing. They were very complicated, though, to pull off, because the synchronization of all those different units who got lost in the jungles, which does seem to be something Japanese do quite often. I mean, it only makes things worse for the Japanese side when you have these air pilots coming in, ruining your supply line further, debilitating wherever your supply columns are moving on land too, because of the strafing attacks. It made everything so miserable for them. So I think, just like you say in the book, it very much was a defining part of the battle for Edson's Ridge. If they didn't do that, who knows? Edson's Ridge could have been very different.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at the units that infiltrated and got into the airfield perimeter. There's a moment in 53 days where one of the Flight 300 pilots goes to his aircraft, his SBD, and he finds this smear of blood on the fuselage and wing, and a Marine with a Tommy gun just sitting in his cockpit. And this Japanese soldier had actually climbed onto the wing to try to destroy the aircraft.
Yep.
And the Marine Tommy gunned him on on the wing, and he fell off and slid off behind the flaps and fell on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how near run this was. I mean, they were actually engaged right along the edge of Henderson Field for a while with an engineer unit. And then a lot of the ground echelon for both of the MAG-23 squadrons that were there, they were engaged also. They were pressed into service as Marine infantry. So, and Vandegrift's headquarters got attacked. There's, I don't know how much of that story is urban legend or not. You read many different tales of, bonsai charges and a master sergeant, basically grabbing a guy and, shooting him in the mouth. And who knows how much of that was true, but the fact was they actually got to his divisional headquarters. So yeah, it was a very near run thing. And, the results of that battle and the bombardment that the Japanese Navy inflicted on the perimeter ends up being kind of the endpoint for 232. These dive bomber guys were down to just a handful of SBDs that were still functional. And then one night during the battle, they had an entire barrage land in their encampment area. And it killed a bunch of the guys from 232 and wounded several others. It actually, the bombardment killed one of the lug nuts that held that squadron together, a guy named Baldy, as he was known. He was an enlisted pilot who had come from Eastern Europe. I mean, this guy was hard scrabble all the way. And he was a senior enlisted pilot, and he was made by Mangrum a second lieutenant. They commissioned him, and he took a pay cut prior to going to Guadalcanal. But it was actually a really brilliant thing for Mangrum to do, because Baldy was one of these old school Marines who had been around for a decade plus. He knew the ins and outs of the Corps like nobody else in 232. And so he became kind of the peer mentor of Mangrum's second lieutenants, who were essentially Marines in name only. I mean, they'd just been in colleges, stateside colleges, before doing their 12-month workup in training, so in flight schools. So Baldy was a really, really important member of the squadron, and when he died, it ripped the heart out of the unit. And within days, they started evacuating the survivors. One of them was wounded, others were medically evacuated. And then you have this moment where Arthur O'Keefe, who is this incredibly devoted young man whose father was a war hero in the First World War. I mean, Art O'Keefe was this kid who grew up in Southern California. His dad was was kind of a titan of the legal scene, and he himself started his own business as a kid. He was very entrepreneurial. He loved photography, spent all of his pre-war money on cameras. And all he wanted to do was contribute. And at the start of the campaign, he fell during a drill on the Long Island and badly injured his hip, to the point where Mangrum didn't think he could even fly and handle the rudder controls. But he absolutely refused to be left behind. And so Mangrum went on deck with him just before they launched for Guadalcanal on August 20th. And Art showed, yeah, I can handle the stick and the rudders. It's not going to be something beyond my capacity. And even though it hurt him, and he limped for weeks from that injury. And by the time the bombardment came around, he was actually in one of the tents that was hit, and he was covered in the gore of what happened to Baldinus and some of the other guys in that tent. Yeah. So that in and of itself was amazing traumatic event for this young American. And then he was flying a search mission a few days later. Even though he had malaria, he had dysentery like the rest of them. But I mean, this is a kid with a fever who's flying an SBD on a search mission with one of the guys that he had gone to flight school with. They were really close friends. And as they were coming into Henderson Field, he looked over, they were down low, their gears were down. A Japanese raid had just arrived, and they were overhead, and somewhere out of nowhere, nobody ever saw the Zero. A Zero came down and hit Kaufman's SBD right next to Art's. And Art saw a fan of blood just erupt from Kaufman's cockpit, and the aircraft went straight into the surf and exploded right in front of him. And just like that, his friend was gone. And the Marines found Art O'Keefe on the ground right next to the runway. After he got down, he was basically in a state of shock, shivering and shaking with, racked by the malarial fever. And they got him to the encampment, and he grabbed his .45 and started shooting the ceiling of the tent, calling out 000s. And that was probably more of a function of his malaria. When you have malaria and a fever, you're hallucinating, and who knows. This guy ends up getting medically evacuated. He's one of the last of the 232 pilots to have actually flown missions. And he goes back to the medical pipeline in California. The Navy tries to kick him out for pre-existing unfitness conditions, so they don't ever have to give him any medical treatment. The family had to get a congressman involved to keep him in the Corps. And eventually he returns to service, and he goes and does another tour on Iwo Jima, where he was an air liaison officer for a division, which was a non-flying billet. But as soon as he got on the island, he realized they needed spotters. So he was flying one of those little spotter airplanes, volunteering for missions and going down low, dropping, grenades, taking photos, spotting positions for Japanese positions for artillery units. And he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for that. He's just an absolutely remarkable young American. And then he went on to a long and storied career in the Marine Corps, where he ultimately commanded at one point John L. Smith's old squadron, 223. But yeah, I mean, like that was essentially the last ride of 232, and how it was destroyed during Hidson's Ridge, even though they played one of the pivotal roles in that battle.
Absolutely. And from there, well, Admiral Nimitz would come over to Guadalcanal to present some medals, which would have boosted morale. But your book, you really captured the sense, and you've said it before, where a lot of these guys just felt tomorrow they were going to die. And that sense of dread, I really feel it encapsulates just the feeling of being on this island, because it's the feeling of almost just being abandoned, because from their point of view, they have to hold out.
100%.
They were expendable. They more or less they were told they were expendable. A lot of them.
Yeah. Yeah, they were told they were cannon fodder.
Yeah.
And like Nimitz meant well. There's no doubt about that. And what he did was crazy brave, as an officer of his rank and position, being in the middle of a battlefield like that was a gutsy thing to do. The problem with medals is that they get very political within units very quickly. And especially Bob Gaylor. So by this point, this was early October or maybe late September. By this point, Guadalcanal had been reinforced. There were more fighter units. There were Navy fighter units. There was additional Marine Corps squadrons coming in as well. So the Cactus Air Force was growing just beyond the original two squadrons, and then the 67th. And Robert Gaylor was one of the other squadron commanders. He was very, very close with John L. Smith, and he would ultimately earn a Medal of Honor in his own right, like John L. did. He wrote in his diary with enduring bitterness that just seeps off the page when you read it, about that award ceremony, and how some of the guys who were most deserving of Navy crosses and Distinguished Flying Crosses did not receive anything. Yeah. And it frustrated him, because that definitely, award ceremonies from senior officers like that should be morale building, but this actually had the opposite effect.
Yeah, he ran out of medals. I know that part of the story.
Yeah, he ran out of medals. And then, one thing I didn't know, Dale Brandon was the squadron commander for the 67th Fighter Squadron. At one point, he was wounded and he was recovering from his wounds. And Hap Arnold came to the theater and demanded to know why his squadron was performing so badly, and basically accused him of cowardice.
Oh, wow.
Just shocking. Shocking to do that to a guy who had lost so many of his men, because the P-400 was just a terrible platform for intercepting anything at altitude. It turned out to be an excellent platform for anti-barge missions and troop strafing. I mean, the 67th played a really important and understated role for sure. But to have the general of the Air Force call you a coward while you're sitting there wounded, that's a bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah, certainly. God, I had no idea Hap Arnold did that much. That's rough.
Yeah. Yep. And so by the end of September, 232 basically ceased to exist. A few of the pilots continued to fly missions here and there, but they were all evacuated not long after Art O'Keefe was. But the ground echelon remained there, and they were working on other squadrons as SPDs. So Mangrum stuck around longer than he needed to make sure that those guys would end up getting out. Along, the pilots were going out by air. The ground echelon was going to go out on ships. And at the same time, VMF 223 continued to fly missions. They lost about 60% of their pilots. And several of the guys who were decorated in that moment with Nimitz ended up dying in the subsequent missions in October. And there were several really, really vicious fights right at the end of the 53 days where the Americans caught the Japanese by surprise and hammered them, and the Japanese took really heavy losses. And then a couple of days later, they caught the Wildcats climbing for altitude. They were, slow going through the clouds. They were in a terrible tactical position, and they just got chopped to pieces. And a lot of guys got lost. John L. Smith got shot down. He survived. Marion Carl had been shot down earlier and had ended up escaping and evading for 5 days before he got back to the perimeter. So, but you look at the guys they went in with, I mean, over and over you see wounded in action, killed in action, missing in action, and some of them were never found. Mangrum's XO, for example, Fletcher Brown, vanished on a raid to Gizo in early September, and they never found his remains. There's been talk that his plane was found on the west coast, northwest coast of Guadalcanal, but I don't think ever that was confirmed. So when you go to like missingmarines.com, a lot of the missing Marines from Guadalcanal are the pilots from these two squadrons and ground and crewmen.
Wow. And the end of the book, you just to quote you actually, because I found it had an overall theme for the experience of the pilots, but you say at the very end of the book, the great takeaway from 53 days, and one I hope our contemporary leaders, both in and out of the military, absorb, is this: an unprepared, under-equipped military may help ease budget constraints, but America's warriors will be forced to pay the balance with their blood. I thought that was very eloquently put, because it really encapsulates so much of this. They were driven to this island with inferior aircraft for the time. They didn't have parts. They had what they were given. They were not going to be receiving supplies for a long time. They were put into a situation actually that's not typical for pilots. Usually pilots face their enemy out in the air somewhere. They don't usually get bombarded where they're landing. So it's incredible. This honestly is the place that made the American pilot of World War II. Because the experience of these guys, I mean, they're all going to go off and have extensive careers, and they're going to help and train the new breed of pilots. So
Absolutely. And that's where Mangrum ended up. He ended up at Corpus Christi as the commandant of cadets for a while. They all came back. Before I go into that, I feel really strongly about that quote. I'm really glad, Craig, that you shared it, because when you look at what's going on today,
yes,
we have a very, very serious strategic situation in the Pacific all over again.
Yep.
And you could make a case that if the Chinese made a move on Taiwan, we are looking at another grander scale version of Guadalcanal. Because if we end up putting one of these new Marine littoral regiments, which are what basically modern day Marine defense battalions, onto the island, they're going to be close to Chinese bases. They're going to be in waters that are going to be contested. There will not be control of the air. That will be contested. And they're going to be on the ground in a position where logistically resupplying them is going to tax the available transports and amphibious vehicles, amphibious ships to the utmost. We just don't have the sea lift capacity to sustain Marines in Taiwan right now. It just doesn't exist. So we have a really, really challenging situation strategically in the Pacific with a rising Chinese Navy, just like the Japanese Navy was a rising force in 1941. And I really think it behooves our strategic planners to go back and really look at what happened at Guadalcanal and really think about Guadalcanal and the Philippines in 41, 42 for that matter.
Yeah.
Because there are some really relevant lessons to extract. And one of them is you can cut costs. You can order airplanes that are poorly constructed. You can order weapons that don't work. You can do that all day long. You can order ships that don't have any real purpose or minimal purpose in this kind of scenario. I mean, you can make a case that the littoral combat ships are exactly that. You can make all those mistakes. But ultimately, it's the sons and daughters of American citizens and American taxpayers that are going to pay the price for those mistakes. It's not going to be the senior leaders and the senators and the congressmen. They are not going to suffer the consequences. It's going to be the people who are in the front lines, just like Arthur O'Keefe and Dick Mangrum and, Colonel Edson. You look at what happened to Edson. And he basically becomes the unsung hero of the Pacific War. Nobody knows who he is today, except the 3% that are passionate about history, like you and I are.
Sure.
He goes on, and 1956 he commits suicide. It's just a tragic story, and the same thing happened with John L. Smith. So the consequences to not having the right force, not having the right force that's equipped properly for the mission, and not having the right number of people available to carry the mission out, the consequences of that are generational when it comes to a war.
Certainly are. I think, to put it frankly, if I was saying to my audience members, because perhaps my audience never even considered, the plight of pilots during such an event like this. I don't think they get the lion's share of the interest. I think specifically when it comes to Guadalcanal, the first thing is the Marines on the ground. That's what they would think of. And a lot of, I get a lot of comments about the naval battles. I think those are very enticing. Yeah, I believe it's very important to realize that, especially for these pilots, every single day they had to do these sorties. They were overworked. It was incredible.
Yeah. They didn't have any spare pilots, especially 232. 223, John L's fighter pilots got plussed up a little bit from units down at Afate periodically. But for the most part, and they rotated. They had something of a rotation, but they never had enough pilots or planes for that matter. So they're flying every day, right? Almost every day. They're flying sick. They're flying sometimes still bleeding from wounds they got in the last fight from the day before. And yet when they land, first off, just operating off of Henderson Field at the time was a hazard because the field was in such bad shape. There were bomb craters everywhere. Torn up Marston matting would rip the tires open. All of the gravel that had been laid down every time they took off and landed would just pound the underside of the aircraft, tear up chip the props, tear up the flaps. I mean, the aircraft were just
battered.
Bad. And they get out of the airplane and they're under sniper fire. And in fact, 223 lost one of their fighter pilots from a sniper while he was taking a bath in a local creek. He was badly wounded and evacuated. So there was no safe place for them. Just like the Mud Marines, there was no safe place in the perimeter for the Mud Marines. And it was identical for the Marine Airmen, because if you managed to not get hit by a sniper, then there was artillery fire from Pistol Petes or the 75s that were with Kawaguchi, or the naval gunfire that would come in from submarines or, the destroyer task forces. I mean, there were so many different threats. It was a clutch gut check moment in American history for all of those Marines. And then later the infantry regiment that showed up was, I think it was the 164th, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So it had an effect on everybody who was there. It was usually for the Marines and for the aviators, for sure, who were there at the beginning of the campaign. It was the defining moment of their lives. And that's actually later reflected in the Corps and how the Corps evolves after Guadalcanal, because it was the defining event for the Marine Corps for a generation as well. Mm-hmm. And so you look at what happens to the Corps following Guadalcanal, following World War II, like all the old Guadalcanal vets end up in key positions. Marion Carl becomes a 2-star general. He takes one of the first Marine brigades to Vietnam at the start of the Vietnam War. And you have Richard Mangrum. At the end of his career, he's a lieutenant general, and he's the assistant commandant for air for the Marine Corps. So they went very, very far. They had tremendous influence, and all of that was shaped by and their experience and their decisions making later on in life. It all flowed from their experience on the island.
And I just want to say to my audience, personally, as somebody who's had to write extensively about Guadalcanal, this was one of the first times I had read a book that explicitly looked at the perspective of the pilots. And I found it extremely interesting because it's almost as if all of these events that I know that are going to happen, that happened during the Guadalcanal campaign, not that they're distant, but I'm seeing it from a completely different perspective. And it changed the way that I saw a lot of the battles. And I think I implore anybody, please go check out this book, because if you've already read a lot about Guadalcanal, I assure you there's a lot of new information that I came across in this. Very pleasantly surprised. It's an excellent book. Again, that's 53 Days on Starvation Island.
Thank you very much, Craig. I tried to really delve into who these pilots were and tell their story from their perspective. And actually, one of the things that I decided to do was write about what happened when John L. and Dick Mangrum and Marion Carl came home first. So you could see who they were as individuals thrown into the spotlight. Very, very quiet professional warriors, all three of them. And suddenly they're being turned into national heroes, and they despised that. And the first part of the book is kind of the study of what their heroes tour looked like, and it delved into the different aspects of American life at 1940. This point in 1942 in the lives of American citizens, and they were not pleased with what they saw because the country didn't seem like it was taking the war seriously to them. They were starving on Japanese rice 2 weeks before they ended up at a University of Georgia football game, watching people screaming and cheering for the team. The homecoming queen dressed to the nine, holding roses. It just looked like a pre-war typical Saturday. And they really didn't like seeing that. They wanted to see America serious because they knew the consequences were going to be severe. And America wasn't ready for what those consequences would be. I mean, we were running around building victory gardens and collecting scrap metal. But where it really hits home is the following year, when the telegrams from the War Department start reaching homes in every community. And you see the war redraw the fabric of every town, large and small, in the United States. And these guys, especially John L., and one interview he did with the Atlanta Constitution, really tried to drive that point home. And I don't think America was really ready to listen to it. So,
is there anything that you might want to say to the audience, particularly why they should go get your book? And I believe it comes out on May the 14th.
It does. It's next Tuesday, actually.
Yeah.
It's May 14th. Well, first off, I'd like to say the only reason why I have a career and I get to do what I get to do is because of my readership. So I cannot tell you how grateful I'm getting all choked up. I'm just extremely grateful for all of you who find my books to be worthy of your time. I mean, we live in a day and age where our time is under siege from every direction, and sitting down and actually reading a book, it's tough. So thank you. And if you read it, if you do buy it and you read about these guys, please advocate for them and the experiences that they had. That's why I do this. Sorry, Craig, I get really emotional thinking about this sort of thing, but advocate for them and their experience, and tell your friends about what they did and accomplished. They are remarkable Americans who were thrown into one of the worst imaginable scenarios and told to just fight and die. And not only did they fight and die, but they helped turn things around and played a role far outsized their numbers. 12 pilots in the dive bomber unit, 12 gunners, and 19 pilots with the fighter squadron. Yeah. They really helped shape the world we live in today with what they did.
And I think it goes without saying, for the younger generation, particularly with the Gen Zs, they don't have the same interest and engagement with these kinds of things. And this is information that's important because, like they say, those who don't learn history, are doomed to repeat it. And today we're living in a world full of conflict, and it seems like war is always at the cusp. And we need to learn from our grandfathers and the people that had suffered under this, that we shouldn't repeat it. We have to do everything we can.
Craig, you're absolutely right. And, we're under siege as Americans culturally. I mean, we have become so obsessed with the negative things in our history and the many sins in our closet. I mean, there's no denying that the United States has a closet full of sins. You'd be crazy. But to deny that. But the issue is there's a lot of good too, and there's a lot of inspiration that can be found. And boy, I'll tell you what, the Gen Z young men that I know through my son, who is a Gen Z young man, they have grown up in a culture that is often overtly hostile to them, and navigating that and trying to figure out who you are as a young American man in 2024, that's tough. That is a really, really tough position to be in. So one of the reasons why I wrote this was in hopes of giving a roadmap to this generation. Like, look, this is your DNA. This is where you came from. These are the kinds of people that we are in the clutch, and you're part of that. That exists in you. And don't ever forget it. And yet, unfortunately, I think we have. I mean, we're 80 years removed from this war at this point.
It feels it feels like they have this saying after the wall came down with the USSR that history stopped. It hasn't stopped.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it feels like it's gone off the rails in more than one way.
Yeah.
And that we're actually in a much more dangerous world than we were when it was just the bipolar Cold War conflict.
Yeah.
So Craig, I really appreciate the time to be able to talk with you and your audience about these things, especially your Gen Zers, because this is really an important thing. And I think might be able to help, give them inspiration and give them a reminder of who we are as Americans.
Well put. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig.